Western society prides itself on the idea that the bloody ideologies of the past are just that, in the past. When we look at the science of what it actually takes to turn a large group of people into a society that would buy into tyrannical ideas, the prospect of those ideologies coming back seem all too likely. For some, this may sound like an extreme conclusion. Surely we have progressed as a society, and the all-knowing leaders we elect to run our Western institutions should never steer us toward tyranny. What makes everyday people trust these individuals who they've never met, who are often unelected, figures with long titles, who speak with certainty about things like who our enemies are, what liberties we ought to give away? Oftentimes they speak of the greater good, and they speak of actions that if not carried out en masse, that amounts to you being an enemy that's against the public good. Today we talk about the psychology of obedience and why the predisposition to authority has enabled bad actors in suits, lab coats, and military uniforms to manipulate society. We are living through a mass psychosis created by authority figures in the Western world. I'm Janelle Batts, and this is a special edition of Real Two. This is the second episode in our series about media manipulation. Today we look at the science behind this phenomenon of obedience. Often people wonder, what will finally make people wake up? How are people able to just go along with what their leaders tell them? Let's look at what science says about this, and then we'll see this in practice throughout history. First, we look at the Milgram study. What was the study? It's a study that looked into what percentage of regular people who would go along with horrific practices in the name of obedience to authority, also known as the Milgram experiment. The study found that a majority of people would go along with committing heinous acts against perfect strangers if someone in an official capacity ordered them to do so. Let's look at it.
Who was the man behind the study? Stanley Milgram, an American social psychologist, was known for his controversial experiments that exposed the limits of societal obedience. Milgram, whose parents fled the Nazi regime, was inspired by the Holocaust, notably the trial of Adolf Eichmann. Adolf Eichmann managed the logistics for the mass deportation of Jews across the German-controlled areas to the extermination camps. Milgram took great interest in the trial for the SS officer, mainly Eichmann's defense that he was just following orders. During the trial, even when faced with the horrific actions that took place at his direction, he showed no signs of guilt. In a statement requesting a pardon, he said, "There is a need to draw a line between the leaders responsible and the people like me, forced to serve as mere instruments in the hands of the leaders." This argument and indifference likely played an internal role into what inspired this experiment, into how submission to governing edicts and governing authority shape the human mind and the actions that follow. How did the experiment work? The study worked like this. Volunteers were recruited to participate in a study of learning. The volunteer was told that the student was also a fellow volunteer. They drew straws, and the straws were fixed. So the volunteer would always be the volunteer, and the student would always be the student. The student was placed in an electric chair, and the volunteer, who was called the teacher, would administer the shocks to the student. The student and teacher were placed in separate rooms. The teacher was told to issue an electric shock.
I'm up to 180 volts.
Please continue, teacher.
Needle, you're gonna get a shock. 180 volts. understand it now. I'm not going to kill that man, eh? I mean, who's going to take the responsibility if anything happens to that gentleman?
I'm responsible for anything that happens here. Continue, please.
You accept all the responsibility?
The responsibility is mine, correct. Please go on.
Gold, dollar, necklace, moon, paint. Answer, please. Are you all right? 405 volts. The answer is moon.
The teacher was told every time the student gave the wrong answer, he was to increase the voltage of the shock. During the study, the experimenter was told he was only allowed to prod the teacher 4 times during the experiment. The prod consisted of 4 canned responses. After the prods, the experiments would end. Prod 1 was please continue. Prod 2 was the experiment requires you to continue. Prod 3, it is absolutely essential that you continue. Prod 4, you have no other choice but to continue. The teacher was told that the shocks ranged from 15 volts, a slight shock, to a severe shock of 375, to a critical shock level of 450 volts.
All of the participants went to 300 volts, a severe shock, and 65% of those who participated continued to the highest level of 450 volts, even though they were told beforehand this was a critical amount of voltage. What they found was that ordinary people were likely to follow orders given by authority figures, even to the extent of killing another person. In an article summing up this study, titled The Perils of Obedience, the author of the study said, "The legal and philosophic aspects of obedience are of enormous import, but they say very little about how most people behave in concrete situations. I set up a simple experiment at Yale University to test how much pain an ordinary citizen would inflict on another person simply because he was ordered to by an experimental scientist. Stark authority was pitted against the subject's strongest moral imperatives against hurting others. And with the subject's ears ringing with the screams of the victims, authority won more often than not. The extreme willingness of adults to go to almost any lengths on the command of an authority constitutes the chief finding of the study, and the fact most urgently demanding an explanation." We wanted to know more about this experiment of obedience, so we looked at the follow-up study to this. Here is that study.
The Hoffling Hospital Experiment. This version of the study follows nurses instead of random individuals. I guess the thinking was, maybe those regular folks couldn't quite grasp the implication of the commands being given during the shock study. So what was the Hoffling Hospital Experiment? This study was called the Hoffling Study, and it was conducted in 1966 and was thought to be a more realistic study of obedience to authority. The experiment involved 22 real night nurses. The fictitious doctor would phone the nurses and ask them to check the medicine cabinet and look for a drug titled estrogen. When they checked to see, they were able to see the maximum dosage for that drug was 10 milligrams. The doctor on the phone would tell them to administer 20 milligrams of the drug, double the maximum dosage according to the label. Mr. Smith, they were told, was the patient, and he was in desperate need, and that the doctor would sign off later when he arrived. The phone call would end if either the nurses obeyed the order, resisted the order, went to seek advice, became upset, could not find the medication, or if the call lasted more than 10 minutes. Now, the pill was actually a sugar pill, obviously harmless. If the nurse tried to give the patient the drug, they would have been stopped. Also, if the nurse were to administer the drugs, they would be in violation of 3 hospital rules, which were: 1. They weren't allowed to accept instructions over the phone, and 2. The dose was double the maximum limit on the box, and 3. The medicine itself was unauthorized because it did not meet the stock list requirement for that ward.
They found that 21 out of 22 nurses obeyed the doctor's orders. 11 nurses admitted to knowing the maximum dose of the drug. The other 10 say they did not notice the dose, but said they thought it was safe because they were ordered to do it by a doctor. They had a control group who answered the problem through questionnaire, and 95% of the control group said they would not have followed the commands of the doctor. Do any of you believe these control group nurses would go against authority if put in the same predicament? A separate study in 1977, conducted by a doctor named Jacobson, found that when a nurse knew the name of the drug, they could not replicate the results. What I take that to mean is when someone is informed, they're more likely to make the best choice, even if it bucks authority.
We are the monsters. There's no place to hide.
The fruits of this obedience to the experts can be seen by several manipulated events that had historical consequences. These lies shape the world in horrendous ways. The mass psychosis surrounding these events have been so strong, and throughout these events themselves are still widely believed to be on the up and up, despite them being provably false flags. These things would not be possible without the help of a willing media, corporations, government, and the public, who are all too predisposed to follow authority.
Operation Northwoods. In the 1960s, top military leaders proposed perpetrating false terrorist attacks across the United States in order to instigate a war with Cuba and communism as a whole. They proposed hijacking planes, blowing up U.S. ships, and sinking boats of Cuban refugees. The plan was later rejected by then U.S. President John F. Kennedy. The words of his predecessor, Dwight D. Eisenhower, likely played a role in his rejection to the plot. Dwight Eisenhower served at the highest levels of the military, and during his final address to America, he said this:
"Who is the very structure of our society. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals."
This is probably one of the last times the establishment class was denied a false flag event, because they sure don't have a problem staging them now.
The false testimony of Naira. A 15-year-old Kuwaiti girl gave damning testimony about the atrocities during the Iraqi army's occupation of Kuwait. The world was stunned by these atrocities. Only problem was, it was completely made up.
While I was there, I saw the Iraqi soldiers come into the hospital with guns. They took the babies out of the incubators. Took the incubators and left the children to die on the cold floor. It was horrifying. I could not help but think of my nephew, who, if born premature, might have died that day as well.
girl offered the testimony under oath at the Congressional Human Rights Caucus, a group formed by one Democrat and one Republican. We'll get more into that later. In the young girl's testimony, she stated that the Iraqis were removing babies from incubators and leaving them to die. This allegation was corroborated by Amnesty International. The testimony was a major contributing factor into the U.S. involvement in the region and led to Operation Desert Storm. If the media were curious at all, they would have easily found out that this little girl was no innocent bystander, but the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador to the United States. The Kuwaitis had hired Hill and Knowlton, an international public relations marketing firm, whose customers include the top media companies and 50% of all Fortune 500 companies. Are you getting it yet? If the media had half a brain, they would have seen that the Congressional Human Rights Caucus actually had offices in the Hill and Knowlton, Washington, D.C. Bureau office. Also, it was later found out that the Kuwaiti government paid Hill and Knowlton $10 million. And with that $10 million, Hill and Knowlton fabricated the story of this 15-year-old girl and used the ambassador's daughter to peddle this lie. Also, that Hill and Knowlton has spent $1 million on a focus group to figure out just what it would take to get the world outraged enough to go to war. This isn't to say the Iraqis shouldn't have been pushed back into Iraq, but when you look at the fact this story was completely fabricated out of whole cloth, and the media had to have been in on it simply because the story would have been so easy to unravel with just a simple search.
A media, not bought and sold, would have been able to see this was no victim, but the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador to the United States. The Kuwaiti government got their country back. The U.S. taxpayer was billions more in debt.
The lie of WMD.
It was a mistake. The war in Iraq, we spent $2 trillion, thousands of lives. We don't even have it. Iran is taking over Iraq with the second largest oil reserves in the world. Obviously, it was a mistake. So George Bush made a mistake. We can make mistakes, but that one was a beauty. We should have never been in Iraq. We have destabilized the Middle East.
But so you still think he should be impeached?
I think it's my turn, isn't it?
You do whatever you want. You call it whatever you want. I want to tell you, they lied.
Okay.
They said there were weapons of mass destruction. There were none, and they knew there were none. There were no weapons of mass destruction.
One of the biggest lies of the modern era is the lie of WMD in Iraq, weapons of mass destruction. Bush and his administration used the excuse of WMD as a catalyst to invade Iraq and depose the horrific dictator Saddam Hussein.
I take the threat very seriously. I take the fact that he develops weapons of mass destruction very seriously.
Now, what makes WMD one of the biggest lies of the modern era is because it served as the main pretense for us to go into war. The lie of WMD is so pernicious that there are people still to this day who posit this hoax. Let me be clear about something. There were never any weapons of mass destruction, as the Bush regime laid out as a pretext for war in Iraq. Sure, Iraq possessed old stockpiles of chemical weapons and had to use these in the war with Iran. But there is a big difference between that and what they were claiming, which were mobile truck units with biological factories inside of them. The lie was based on the account of one man, Rafid Ahmad Alwan, an Iraqi defector who told German intelligence this tale. The U.S. and its allies not only spread this tale, but also corroborated it. The media, for its part, were all but willing accomplices, because at the end of the day, if it bleeds, it leads. This lie would prove staggering for the United States. $1.6 trillion spent over a decade. Leaders like Donald Rumsfeld assured America that the cost of the war would only be about $100 billion in total.
Hysteria, like the kind that took place after 9/11 and the invasion of Iraq, or the communist regime in Cuba, often make the public more malleable to foreign adventurism. Sometimes these events in and of themselves aren't enough to spur the type of involvement the elites may want, so they necessitate a little manipulation. The experts, elites, men in suits, uniforms, and lab coats have proven themselves to be willing accomplices to the duplicity, and the public is left holding the bag. Here are more examples of how lies shaped our world, this time of the medical variety.
Operation Sea Spray. Over a 20-year period in the 1950s, the U.S. government conducted 239 bacteria attacks on U.S. cities. Now, what brought this test on? Government at the time was very concerned about attacks on U.S. cities, biological attacks, bacterial attacks. So, what they decided to do for the next 20 years is to do biological and chemical attacks across the United States themselves. And of course, they said they were perfectly harmless. A lot about the test and their locations aren't known, but San Francisco, New York, Key West, Florida, Alaska, and Pennsylvania are the known places, the places that we know about, where they launched these attacks. Now, the attack in San Francisco, how they perpetrated that was they had a naval vessel in the bay. It had to shoot its water cannons up in the sky, and in that water cannon's fluid, they had infused the bacteria that they planned to release, so the spray would waft into the city. Now, they have no idea people were hurt by this. There are accounts that are disputed that there were 11 people that went to the hospital with urinary tract infections after that. And there also is one man we're going to talk about that actually died, they think, due to this. Now, there are many more that were likely affected by this, but the government hasn't come clean about any of it, and most of it is classified. The attacks were initiated in many ways. As we said before, the mist was sprayed from a naval vessel in San Francisco Harbor. They also had briefcases that they would carry into airport terminals and subways. They also had light bulbs filled with the bacteria that they would drop in public places to spread the bacteria to see its effects. Now, like I said before, the effects aren't widely known due to the secret nature of these tests. There was only one man, Edward J. Naveen, whose family sued after he died of a bacterial infection right after the San Francisco test. The official position of the experts from the CDC was that the Bay Area populace should be pleased. There's less than 1 chance in 100 that anyone was hurt by this. So the judge went along with it and said that the family could not sue the United States government. The Willowbrook experiments. Children in a mental hospital in Staten Island, New York, were subject to a study to find a vaccine for hepatitis. Now let's rewind back for a second. During this time in history, in the 1950s, children with mental issues were put into mental institutions. There was a doctor named Dr. Krugman. He was a former flight surgeon in the U.S. Army Corps. He went to the school with a proposition. He wanted to create a vaccine for hepatitis and knew the perfect place and where he could do research. Willowbrook was overcrowded and already rampant with disease at the time, and it wasn't uncommon to test vaccines on children. The children were told to ingest a cocktail of feces and chocolate milk in order to be infected with the disease and to test their immunity. Dr. Saul Krugman oversaw these tests. Families, desperate for help with their mentally disabled children, were pushed to the front of the line for admissions if they were to allow this man to test on their children. A lot of families did. They didn't know any better. Regardless of what you may think of this, the medical community was mostly in support of this. The doctor received awards for his work, and was even made the president of the American Pediatric Society, a national organization that has as its mission to advance child health. The facility, however, Willowbrook, was criticized by figures like Robert F. Kennedy, then a New York senator, who was reported as saying there are no civil liberties for those put in the cells of Willowbrook. He denounced the practices of the hospital in congressional testimony. Now, you may know this name, Geraldo Rivera, who was a local reporter at the time in New York, snuck into the hospital, and what he saw shocked Americans across the country.
It's been more than 6 years since Robert Kennedy walked out of one of the wards here at Willowbrook and told newsmen of the horror he'd seen inside. He pleaded then for an overhaul of a system that allowed retarded children to live in a snake pit. But that was way back in 1965, and somehow we'd all forgotten. I first heard of this big place with the pretty-sounding name because of a call I received from a member of the Willowbrook staff, a Dr. Michael Wilkins. The doctor told me he'd just been fired because he'd been urging parents with children in one of the buildings, building number 6, to organize so they could more effectively demand improved conditions for their children. The doctor invited me to see the conditions he was talking about, so unannounced and unexpected by the school administration, we toured building number 6. The doctor had warned me that it would be bad. It was horrible. There was one attendant for perhaps 50 severely and profoundly retarded children, lying on the floor naked and smeared with their own feces. They were making a pitiful sound, a kind of mournful wail that it's impossible for me to forget. This is what it looked like, this is what it sounded like, but how can I tell you about the way it smelled? It smelled of filth, it smelled of disease, and it smelled of death. We've just seen something that's probably the most horrible thing I've ever seen in my life. Is that typical of ward life?
Yes, there are 5,300 patients at Willowbrook, which is the largest institution for the mentally retarded in the world.
Now, the experts who ran this facility were not held accountable, and the pharmaceutical industry only enriched themselves with the research gleaned from this horrible, horrible activity.
In collaboration with the government, major pharmaceutical corporations and the military-industrial complex have perpetuated some of the most heinous experiments on the American public, skirted international law, the Constitution, human rights, and the Hippocratic Oath. These stories used to be looked at as conspiracy theories, and for some, they still are. The tyranny follows a similar pattern of an incident that is followed by hysteria. That incident is used as a tool to manipulate the world into surrendering our liberties, whether that be medical tyranny or military. Your privacy and autonomy have to take a back seat. The similarities between the military-industrial complex and the medical-industrial complex are far too close to ignore. A cloistered group of experts who are seen as infallible, and their results are never weighed in hindsight. These groups operate with the full support of both sides of our political establishment. The media can't get enough of these people, and the American people can't seem to escape them.
Start a, come on, start a riot. When they love you too much, know it's fame, fake, or even hate. Don't be scared if the weight paralyzes your state at the gate. No, it's a lot to take in. It's designed to know when, don't wait. Don't be scared when the weight paralyzes your state at the gate.